I'm really pleased this evening to have the chance to talk to you all about autism. As Danielle's just said, I'm a SENCO working in Bristol city centre. I've been a SENCO now for 8 years. We find we have a lot of children with autism at our school, and as a result, we've set up a classroom specifically for children with autism, but we also have many autistic learners who are part of the main classrooms in the school as well. So I'm hoping some of the things that we cover this evening will help in supporting some of our autistic learners that you are working with as well. Sorry, I'll just set up for the presentation. So this evening, we're going to start by looking at briefly what autism is to make sure we have an understanding of that. But the key focus is going to be looking at different strategies and support that you can put in place for these learners. And in particular, we're going to be looking at how we can support them with communication, social interaction, looking at how we can support with task engagement, and also how we address some of the negative behaviours that we might see. And then, as Danielle said, we'll be finishing this evening with a chance to have a question and answer session. So starting off with what autism is. Autism is often referred to as autism spectrum condition, ASC, or autism spectrum disorder, ASD. The reason there's two different ways of saying it, so the clinical way most people refer to it currently still is autism spectrum disorder, but a lot of the autistic community are not particularly happy with that terminology and don't like the term that it's a disorder. So many of them will choose to use the word condition instead. Autism is a neurodevelopmental difference which presents with either social communication difficulties and interaction difficulties, but it also displays in particular behaviours and different interests and how those people respond to those different interests. Now, on the slide, you will see a picture there of how the autism spectrum disorder has been currently represented. Historically, it was thought of as a linear process. So people would refer to, often you might hear people referring to higher functioning autism and lower functioning autism, and that idea that you sat somewhere kind of on this line, whereas the thoughts have kind of changed now that it's a spectrum. So different people on the autism spectrum will have different elements of these different things, and some of those things will be more severe than others. So for example, for some people with social awareness, that might be something that they have a really big struggle with, whereas actually they're very able to communicate verbally, whereas a contrasting autistic person may really struggle with their verbal communication but have a lot more social awareness. And you often might hear people referring to autistic people as having a spiky profile. And that's the idea that they may have some real strengths in certain areas, but then also there's kind of weaknesses in those areas of difficulty as well. So as I kind of mentioned on the last slide, the views and thinking around autism have changed quite dramatically over the last few years. And I thought it was important to kind of address some of those different stereotypes and myths that you might have heard around autism. So lots of people maybe come with preconceived ideas about what autism is. And I've chosen that picture of Dustin Hoffman as Rain Man. Those of you who are children of the 80s and 90s probably have grown up with that kind of image, and that idea of that's what's being projected out as what autism is. Whereas the understanding now is very different, and that kind of pigeonholing it just to that very kind of tight idea of what autism is has changed, and more people are starting to realise and identify that maybe they are also autistic as well. So the first really common myth is that autism is only a condition in boys. at current time, there are more boys being diagnosed than girls, but that is changing. As I say, as that understanding of what autism is, we are starting to identify more and more girls who have those different traits and those difficulties. What we have found is that girls are often much better at masking the difficulties they have, so they're harder to identify. So as practitioners, it's important that we are able to kind of see beyond those stereotypes and help to identify maybe those people who don't fit that kind of classic idea of what autism is. Another really common misconception is that all autistic people have special talents. Again, there are many, many autistic people who maybe have some savant tendencies. So you often will know, maybe have heard about autistic people who may have an amazing ability to play the piano or have fantastic skills in maths. And those things can be true, but it's also not true of all autistic learners. Another thing which is almost slightly, as you can see, conflicting to the one before is that all autistic people have learning disabilities. Now, it's thought that around 1 in 4 autistic people also will have learning disabilities, but that obviously leaves a high percentage of autistic people who don't have a learning disability co-occurring with their autism. So it's really important not to kind of fall and have those different assumptions. Also, another common assumption that people might make is that autistic people are unsociable. And now again, some may choose to not want to have to spend time around other people, and there may be a whole range of different reasons why they might find it difficult to be around other people. But there are many, many people in the autistic community who really enjoy spending time with other people. And in fact, some that will almost really seek out and crave having that social interaction. I'm lucky enough to have many autistic friends, and they really do enjoy coming out and being able to socialise. So it's really important not to assume that autistic people don't want to socialise with other people. Another really common misconception is that autistic people don't have any emotions, and actually this could almost be the opposite of what the true fact is. Often autistic people may have difficulties with expressing or showing their emotions in a way that many of us might understand, but actually they can often feel emotions even more profoundly than those of us in the neurotypical community. And I've often heard people mentioning that maybe autistic people don't have empathy and aren't able to empathize with others. And also that really is almost the opposite of what can be true for many autistic people. Some autistic people are almost so empathetic that when they walk in a room and they can tell something's not quite right, they can feel that tension, but it's almost overwhelming for them to be able to cope and manage with, rather than them not understanding or being able to pick up on any of those emotions. The last one is that autism is caused by environmental factors. We now know that autism is a hereditary condition, and so it's passed down through families. And often now, lots of families I work with, when maybe they have a child that's diagnosed, they can often reflect and maybe see some of those autistic traits in them as parents as well, or maybe in a grandparent or someone else within their family. For a long time, there was a thought that maybe the MMR vaccine caused autism, but there is absolutely no scientific evidence to support any of these ideas. Now, obviously, the environment a child lives in is always going to impact on how they develop and how they grow, but the autism itself is something that a child is born with and will have throughout their entire lives. It's nothing to do with impacts or factors that have happened to them within their lives. Now, at this point, I think it's really important to touch on and talk a little bit about neurodiversity. So as I mentioned at the start, autism is a neurodivergence. And you may have heard a lot now people talking about neurodiversity. And I think it's really important to kind of unpick what neurodiversity is to make sure that everyone here has that really clear understanding when people are using that terminology. So in the past, people used to think of lots of different things about autism. As I say, they might have thought that it was different things, like there was environmental factors that influenced it. Some people felt like it was almost a disease or something that needed to be cured. Now, thoughts have really changed in recent years around autism and that understanding of what it is. So autism is a neurodivergence, and what that means is that people with autism, their brains work a little bit differently from those people who are neurotypical. There are a huge range of different neurodiversities, and in that umbrella with the droplets there, you can see some of those different neurodiversities. So a neurodiversity is defined as a natural variation in the human brain. So something that makes it function a little bit differently to the majority of the population. Neurodivergent brains, they will have that difference. So they will, it will affect how their brain works. And then we also refer to people as being neurotypical. So the neurotypical people are the majority, and that's their brain functions in a similar way. Now, what we find is, as obviously as you would expect, the world is set up for people who have got the neurotypical brain. They are in the majority, and that is, the world is set up for, that's how they work. What we're trying to now do and what changes are being made within society is that understanding of those people with neurodivergent brains. It's not that there's something wrong with their brain, it's just that it doesn't work in the same way as those people with neurotypical brains. So it's trying to support them and help them to work in a world that is maybe not quite set up for their brain. So alongside that, so today we're really going to be thinking about kind of neuroaffirming practice. So alongside with this really increased understanding in neurodivergence, a lot of the ways we do things in school now and in society is trying to ensure that we're being neuroaffirming to the children that we're working with, and not making them feel different or excluded, or that there's something wrong with them or the way they do things. It's helping them to understand how they can cope and manage with those differences that they have. So I'm hoping lots of the strategies and things I will give you today will help and be neuroaffirming. What I do need to add to that, though, is things have been changing quite rapidly in the last few years, and lots of the resources and ways of thinking that have been going on for many, many years before that. It takes time for some of those things to change. So what we found in the setting where I'm working is some of maybe the interventions and the things that we put in place, we're having to start to adapt ourselves and think about how we can present things in a different way to make sure that they are neuroaffirming. So to kind of give some really concrete examples of that, in the past, there was a practice called ABA that was used quite heavily, particularly in America. So the autistic community have now come out, so those that were maybe children who've experienced ABA and have spoken about how traumatic they have found those experiences. So a lot of the ABA practice that maybe we were using in our settings over here now, we're starting to try and think and find other ways to work and not do those things, so that our autistic community can understand that the way they are is absolutely fine, and that we're there to help and support them. So I just want to talk a little bit about diagnosis, and lots of you may have seen lots of things about diagnosis with autism in the media, because as you may be aware, there currently is very long waiting lists, and it can be quite challenging to gain the diagnosis. So to order to have a diagnosis of autism, it requires an assessment by two professionals. Generally in Bristol, that will be a speech and language therapist and a community paediatrician. But they have recently started to recruit and train some other professionals to be able to do that to help to reduce some of those waiting lists. In Bristol, they've recently introduced an autism hub that carries out the assessments for autism. And again, this has been a way that the health services have been working to try and help bring down those really long wait lists. Currently, children that are being referred for an autism referral have at least a 2-year wait time before they're able to be seen. And for some children now, it is estimated that it will be much longer. They've now moved to a kind of streaming service where some children will be prioritised. So children who maybe have no language at all, or who are maybe struggling to remain in a school, will get a higher priority. So those children who maybe have those autistic traits but are managing and coping generally may have a lot longer wait for a diagnosis. And I think it's important to be aware of that because maybe many of the young people you may end up working with, whilst the professionals working with them may have recognised that they display a lot of autistic traits, it is quite likely these days that they may not have received an autism diagnosis, and that may just purely be that they're sat on that wait list waiting for that official diagnosis. In our setting, we certainly don't wait for an autism diagnosis to put in practice the different strategies. And I feel as a society as a whole, we are moving away from that need to have that firm diagnosis before being able to put in place the strategies. So we're starting to go much more from a needs-led basis. So looking at the needs of the child and looking at how we address them rather than them needing to have a formal diagnosis. I think another important thing to add in here is that often there can be cultural differences around acceptance of autism, and for some families they don't want to pursue a diagnosis. I work in a predominantly Somali school, and many of the families there are quite fearful of autism and don't feel they want that label for their child. So there may be many reasons why a child you're working with hasn't got a diagnosis, but what is important is looking at what the needs of that child are and addressing them rather than them having to have that firm diagnosis. So I touched on a little bit before when we were speaking about the stereotypes about 1/4 autistic people also having a learning disability as well. And I think it's important to touch on a little bit about co-occurrence because it is quite common for people with one neurodivergence to then end up having one or maybe multiple different neurodivergences. And that can make their profile a lot more complex, but it's important to be aware of those things. Today, we're very much focusing on autism and the different traits that might come with that. But it's possible that a child that you're working with has many other neurodivergences alongside. And it's important to recognise that often, once a child's been diagnosed with one neurodivergence, that people feel that that's it, and sometimes it can be quite easy to overlook some of the other neurodivergences that they may have. So the table that we've got displayed has come from some research carried out by Birmingham University. And in that, they've identified where those co-occurrences have occurred. So the blue sections show the chances and how likely there is to have a co-occurring condition for a young person. Now, with Birmingham University, with their research, they were really aware that often that there hadn't always been a diagnosis taking place for a second neurodivergence. But also you will notice there are lots of blanks where there aren't any pie charts at all. And that's because they didn't have enough data around that to even estimate the kind of levels of co-occurrence that might occur alongside with autism. So what you will see if you look along the table with autism, there is quite a high chance of co-occurrence with ADHD. There's also quite a high chance of there being dyspraxia as one of there's so DCD and developmental coordination disorder, often referred to as dyspraxia, is also really common in people with autism as well. So there often is other factors that may be barriers for the young person that you're working with, not just their autism. So with autism, as I kind of said, it's really important not to generalize completely with how a young person will present. And I'm sure you've heard the saying before, if you've met one autistic person, then you've only just met one autistic person. So it's really important not to overgeneralize, but I wanted to pick up on some really common brain characteristics that are often identified in people with autism, because often they can be used and help to kind of define their ways of thinking and help us to understand their brains a little bit more. I think it's also really important to touch on this point that these two brain characteristics can also occur in people with neurotypical brains as well. So just because maybe somebody's got some of these characteristics, it also doesn't define them necessarily as being autistic. So the first one is that most autistic people tend to be bottom-up thinkers. Now, bottom-up thinkers tend to see the tiny little details. So they start off by looking at the little details, and then they will build those up and put them together to build a picture as a whole. The majority of the population tend to be top-down thinking. So most of us will like to start with the general idea of what's going on and have a general understanding, and then like to kind of delve down into those small details. And what you will find is in most education settings, they are more set up for that, having that overview first and then drilling down. So sometimes it is reflecting and thinking about how we can support those bottom-up thinkers and getting them interested in the details first, before then going and helping them to build up that overall picture. The other common brain characteristic is monotropism. Monotropism is best kind of defined or understood as that kind of tunnel vision. So that idea of really being really focused on one thing and really intently looking at that to the exclusion of all else. So again, majority of autistic learners are likely to be monotropic, and so will have really intense interests and will give really intense focus to certain things, to the exclusion of everything else. Now that can come with many, many benefits, but it can also present a lot of difficulties. If you're monotropic, it can be really hard to shift your attention to something else, which can make things like transitions very challenging. It also can mean you can be so focused on one thing that you're not particularly interested in what somebody else is trying to tell you at that time, or what topic is being taught in class. So whereas polytropic individuals can hold in their head lots of different things and think of lots of different things at once. Now, with both bottom-up thinking and monotropism, I think it's really important to recognise that actually these can give our autistic learners some real advantages in certain cases. And we have lots of evidence in history of people who were great thinkers, who we now believe probably did have autism. So there can be lots of benefits to these, but it's also understanding that our world generally isn't set up for these brain characteristics, so it can present challenges as well. You may have heard people often referring to different neurodivergences as superpowers. I feel this can be quite a dangerous way to refer to some of these characteristics. Yes, they can have lots of benefits, and it's really important that we support our autistic learners to understand that they have many strengths and many skills. But I think often referring to their autism as being a superpower kind of then takes away from some of the many challenges that it can present them with as well. So I think it's much more important to kind of think of it as strengths and weaknesses, rather than kind of referring to it in that way. So we're now going to move on and think a little bit about how we support our young people with their communication skills. Now, as we identified at the start, communication and interaction difficulties are one of the key characteristics of being autistic. But again, it's really important to remember that there is huge spectrum and huge variation within where those communication skills may sit. So some individuals may be completely non-verbal, not using any sort of verbal communication, where you may also have somebody with autism who actually has really high level of communication, fantastic vocabulary. Similarly, you may have individuals who really want to be able to interact and gain that connection with other people, and other individuals who maybe haven't even realized that there is a point to communication at all. So I'm hopefully going to take you through some of the different ways we can support all this variety of different communication, picking up on some of those kind of common difficulties that we often find autistic people can have. So I wanted to start by thinking a little bit about verbal communication and how we communicate verbally with our autistic learners. For a lot of our autistic learners, they are really going to struggle and understand that we are wanting to communicate with them. And as I was mentioning before about the monotropism, many of them may be focused on something else. So the first key thing to remember when you're communicating with them is to gain their attention first. And normally the best way to do this is by saying the pupil's name. Now, when I'm talking about gaining attention, I think it's really important to raise here that the way an autistic person may show you that you have their attention may be different from what we might expect. So often, if we're neurotypical, what we generally expect from children, if to show that they're listening to us, is for them to give us eye contact. And I think it's really important to recognize that for many of our autistic learners, eye contact actually can be really stressful and really difficult. So gaining their attention, you really need to know those signs from that individual that shows you that they're listening. So for some individuals, it may be that they have stopped the activity they're doing. They may have stilled themselves. They may have moved themselves closer to you. But it's trying to see if you've got those signs that you have managed to gain their attention, that they are listening to you. It's really important to keep your language simple and direct. Now, this is obviously particularly important for our children who've got very limited language, but it's also important for many of our autistic learners who maybe have fantastic vocabularies and are able to communicate quite well verbally, because a lot of them can really struggle with processing large chunks of information. So being able to, particularly if you're giving an instruction, to keep it simple and really focus on those key words can really help and support them to understand what it is you're trying to communicate. You need to remember that in a busy school, there'll be lots of other things going on and trying to take away that individual's attention. So you want to really kind of hit home with the kind of key information. And the speech bubble down the bottom gives a kind of example of the sort of thing you might say. So you would go, Anna, and you allow that pause and make sure you've gained that information before saying writing first, then bubbles. So we're just really focusing on those key things that we want that child to do. So they understand that they're going to do that writing first, and then they can get the activity they obviously really want to do, which is the bubbles. Now, the next point is about allowing processing time for that child. And this is something that can be really difficult and feel really unnatural to us. I think naturally most of us feel like we're born to fill every second of silence and feel like we need to constantly be saying things, but we really need to be able to stop and allow processing time for that individual, for that information to go in, and for that child to process it. Now, it's estimated that the average person can take 10 to 15 seconds to process a piece of information. And I think if you stopped now and kind of counted out those 10 seconds, you can start to see that actually that's quite a long period of time. Now, that's an average person. So you've got to bear in mind that for some of our learners, that processing time might be even longer. So it often is really important to be able to stop once you've given that instruction and almost count in your head that time to see if that individual will respond, rather than going at them again and again and again, because then what you're doing is kind of overwhelming that brain and giving them too much information, which then means they may go into complete shutdown. Alongside with that, and about supporting with the processing and keeping things simple, if you feel you need to repeat that instruction, so if after you've waited that 15 seconds and nothing's happening, it's important to repeat that instruction using the same words that you used before. If you start to come in and try and introduce lots of more words, then again, that brain's going to go into meltdown because you're now adding in extra information. And for many of our autistic learners, those words, whilst to you will have the same sort of meaning and are trying to get across the same idea, is giving them a whole separate set of information. So just repeating that instruction again, maybe using some visuals to help and support it, or providing a bit more emphasis, but trying to reuse those words will really help with that autistic person gaining understanding of what you're asking them to do. Really important thing to do when speaking with an autistic person is to try and avoid using idioms and sarcasm. So I put a picture down the bottom of somebody on fire, and that's come for me from a classic example I had with a child once in my classroom who was doing an activity and was getting on really well with that activity. So his teaching assistant had said to him, "Oh, you're on fire," at which point that child jumped up screaming and ran around the classroom. Now, we immediately kind of picked up on what the issue was and what the mistake was, but that child had literally taken what the person had said, and from his understanding, they thought they were on fire. So we can obviously try and teach our autistic learners some different idioms, but it's being really careful about that language and being really explicit and literal about what you mean, rather than using idioms. Similarly with sarcasm, it's unlikely many of your autistic learners are going to be able to pick up on things like tone of voice and sarcasm. So if you're trying to use sarcasm with them, it's likely that they will, again, literally take what you've said rather than picking up on those nuances and understanding that you're being sarcastic. And this can lead to a lot of confusion for our autistic learners. So I think it's something that's really important to bear in mind when you're communicating with them. So alongside our verbal communication and thinking about our words, our non-verbal communication is really important. Now, what's really important to remember is that most of our autistic learners are going to struggle to pick up on most of our non-verbal communication. It is one of the areas that they are likely to have difficulty with. So when you're communicating with most people, they're going to be looking at your face. They will be able to tell maybe from your expression how you're feeling. Maybe you've got a smile on. Maybe if you start to feel frustrated, they'll be able to see that in your face, but also in the tone of your voice as well. And for most of our autistic learners, they are not going to pick up on those cues. So it's really important to kind of exaggerate and emphasize those things to get those messages across. So when I'm praising an autistic person, I'm going to be really emphasizing the fact that I'm really happy with them. I might really emphasize that massive smile on my face. But I also will narrate how I am feeling. So I might be, oh, look at the smile on my face. I'm feeling so happy. This is great what you've just done. That's helping them to build up that understanding of the way I'm acting and the things that I'm doing mean that I'm happy. So hopefully they might start being able to pick up on some of those non-verbal communication from other people, but also will really help them to understand what I'm saying. It also can be really helpful to artistic learners to point out those non-verbal cues. So in ourselves, but also in other people. So often in our setting, if there is a child who's maybe doing a behavior that we don't really want to see, and they're not really getting that we're feeling a little bit cross. So again, we'll really emphasize that. We'll really emphasize the kind of cross look on our face when we will tell them that we are feeling cross with what they're doing, because they might not be able to pick up on those things otherwise. And I think that can be a really important point to think on, particularly I think with our non-verbal learners, maybe lots of us understand that they aren't picking up on those things, but for those children who are able to communicate a lot better, it's understanding that those non-verbal cues may not be there for them. I've known a lot of autistic children who have ended up getting themselves into deeper and deeper trouble because the adult they're working with feels that they're being rude or insolent. So they've maybe been told to stop doing something. The teacher feels that it's really clear that they've, they're sounding cross in their voice and they've told them off, and that they should understand that. But they've maybe continued doing what they're doing, or what is often a classic example is that individual may end up kind of smirking or smiling, because again, they don't realize that that's not an appropriate reaction to what's going on, and then they find themselves getting into more and more trouble. So it's really important to understand those non-verbal cues and how difficult that can be for autistic learners, and how that can lead to a lot of misinterpretation. So then next, I wanted to just touch on, because we were talking about then with non-verbal expectations, and I have touched on this a little bit earlier, but thinking about our individuals and what we are expecting of them as well. I see in a lot of schools that image of the whole body listening and showing the adult that you are listening. And I think it's really important to understand that for some of our autistic learners, that is just not possible. And by forcing them to look at the eyes or keep their hands still, sorry, excuse me, they will, that will cause them so much stress that they won't take in any of the learning at all. Sorry. So it's thinking about what your expectations are and what's reasonable to expect in the classroom, rather than forcing some of those expectations. So now, moving on to my key strategy. If today the only thing you take away from today is please, please, please use visuals with your autistic learners, and not only with your autistic learners, but with all learners, thinking about all areas of special needs, visuals can be helpful, but they're also really supportive of all learners to help everybody understand what is going on. And now this visual here helps to really show and demonstrate the reasons why visuals can be so important. And it's thinking about the different ways that you can use them. Hopefully many of the settings you go and work in have already got a lot of visuals there, but it can really help and support the understanding of those children. So visuals can look different in lots of different ways. And again, it may depend on the needs of your child to what level of communication that you need to use. In our school, we have visual timetables in all the classrooms, and some of our autistic learners may also then have an individual visual timetable that they need to use. And some of them may have, like we have on here, the now and next board, so now, next, and then, so they can follow through and understand what's expected of them. For many children, an adult having visuals on their lanyard for kind of key instructions can really help and support. You can show them to them when they're sat on the carpet, so you're not then interfering and interrupting with what the teaching's going on, but it also helps to reinforce any words that you are saying to that child as well. In many of our settings, we have something called a communication board that you can see down the bottom. And these are out to help and support our children with being able to communicate themselves, but also with the adults when they're communicating, they will point to the relevant visuals to help and support that child as well. I think it's really important as well to understand visual communication can mean physical items, but also gesture is a way of visually representing things. Makaton can be really helpful for our autistic learners if you can learn some of the basics, but also if you don't know specific Makaton signs, using your hands, animating, demonstrating, pointing to things, physically showing children things can really help them to understand what it is you want them to do. Now, on the last page, I had lots of different visuals and things that take time to resource and you may not have to hand. The whiteboard and pen is my most favorite resource in a school. You do not need to have loads of perfectly made printed visuals. A whiteboard and pen is always around and to hand, and you can just pick it up and draw a quick picture. You don't need to be a great artist. In fact, keeping the picture simple is the best thing. Nice stick men, nice drawings can help to show. A quick scribble on a board can really help a child sometimes if you haven't got the correct visual to hand and help them with their understanding. I lastly wanted to touch a little bit on Gestalt language processing. I'm sorry, my throat's really tickly. So our many autistic learners do not build up language in the same way that neurotypical children do. So you may have noticed this in children, some of your autistic children you work with, that they will build up chunks of language. So they will learn set phrases, often maybe from things they've seen on television or heard elsewhere, and they will attribute that to different things. And they will then, from that, gradually use that and be able to use that to translate into building up other language. There are whole courses on Gestalt language processing, and I obviously don't have time today to go too in depth into how the learning works, but I think it's just important to bear in mind that for some children that is how they learn that language, and it's important to validate that language. A really important thing to do is if they are doing that, so the example on there is the original Gestalt was to infinity and beyond, and they may be doing that to say it's time to go, but if they say that and you've understood that it's time to go, you might want to reiterate back and go, yes, to infinity and beyond. And then you might want to then add on to that where you're going to or something like that, so they can start to build that up. Another thing to bear in mind with Gestalt language learners is that asking them lots of questions is not going to help them to build their language and get the answers that maybe you would like. But a better way to do it is to make statements and observations about the things that you've seen so that they can start to build up the language. So using kind of common phrases, so things like, let's go, and things like that, they will start to pick up and learn those phrases well. So we're now going to move on and think a little bit about task engagement and how we can support our autistic learners with engaging in tasks. Routines are really, really important for our autistic learners. It helps to reduce their anxiety when they know what's going on. But I've also touched on a lot of our autistic learners have difficulties with processing skills. So it's helping to reduce that working load. They know what to expect, they know what's going to go on, so they can then focus and get on with the task. It helps them to know what's coming, so it supports that anticipation. They like a bit of predictability, and it also gives them a sense of control over what is happening. Visuals can also really help and support to increase that independence. So if you've set in place routines and then it's supported alongside some of the visuals, so there are some examples here of the different types of visuals that you might be able to use. It can then really help that child to become independent. They don't necessarily need an adult with them all the time to tell them what to do. Once you've established and set up that routine, many of your learners will be able to continue on and do that without that extra support. I mentioned earlier when we were speaking about monotropism, about difficulties with transitions. And throughout a school day, there are many transitions which individuals might struggle with. And that can often be the biggest barrier to getting them to engage with the next task. Your visual schedule is going to be the first place you're going to start with them understanding. So they understand they've got their now and next board and they know what the different activities are. They know what's going to be coming next. That can support them to move on to the next activity, but it also can help them to see if there's a favoured activity later, that they've got that coming. They're not going to be doing English or maths or whatever it is they really don't want to do forever. There is something else coming after that. To then support that transition with your visual schedule, timers can be really helpful. And it's really important that timer is a visual timer for the child. So it could be a sound timer, it could be a clock somewhere, but that child needs to be able to see that so that they can follow it. There's an example up there where an adult's almost doing it as a countdown and adding on, but again, it's visual so the child can see that. It's important as the adult working with them that you are preparing them for that transition. So when that time's coming up, you're going to be reminding them and saying, oh, in 5 minutes, we are going to be moving on to whatever activity, so that they know that that is coming. Transitional objects can also help and support children. So for some children, they may have a favoured item that they like to hold and carry, and for them to know they've got that between the activities can really help and support them to transition. For some children, they may have a transition bin. So that's a set of really activities they really enjoy doing, and they know once they've finished that other activity that they can have something from that transition bin to help them move on to the next activity. It's really important with the children to acknowledge how they're feeling and to let them know that you understand that it's difficult for them to stop whatever task they're doing and moving on. So validate those feelings. And the last thing is allow them time to move on. Okay. I think we're often, and school is pacey and it is hard to keep up, but if you try and push too hard with that transition, it's going to go wrong. They need time for their brain to process what is happening and move on. So give them the time and space to do that, and trust that they will move on and do that when they're feeling ready. Now, I'm sure many of you will be aware of workstations, and these are often used for many autistic learners to help and support them with their learning. I would like to say they're not needed for all autistic learners. We have many autistic learners at my setting who sit at group tables with other children. We have some children who will go and sit at a workstation for times of the day, and some children who, if they're going to be doing any adult directed tasks, they need to be at a workstation. Now, workstations operate by having 2 task trays. So there's the tray on the left-hand side, which has the activities in that you would like that child to complete. And when they have completed them, the child puts them in that finished tray. Now, again, this helps our autistic learners with understanding and the expectations. They know what's going to be expected of them, they can see it there, and then they can move on. And for many children, once they've been trained to use a workstation and been introduced to an activity, they should be able to sit there and complete those activities independently. So a workstation is there as a tool really to help those learners to become more independent. The organisation of your tasks is really important on those workstations. Again, most our autistic learners like order and like to understand what they are being expected to do. So it's really important when how those tasks are presented helps and supports them with what you're expecting them to do. So I've got the example there with the clear visual, so the child can see what they're being expected to do. The other two, I've got an example of a badly presented task and how you could present it more clearly. So with the puzzle, maybe you're saying to the child, I need you to complete 2 puzzles, but you've just given them a big jumbly box. The child's like, oh, I can't do this. Whereas if you've got those 2 puzzles out separate, it's much clearer. They can see the box where you want them. They can complete that. That translates similarly to those children who are more able and are on to completing worksheets. A really jumbled up worksheet with loads of bits on it is going to confuse that child. It's not going to make them want to start. Give them simple, spaced out, they can clearly see what is expected of them. For many of our autistic learners at our school, we just chop their worksheets into pieces and we may give it to them in chunks, sometimes with breaks throughout the day, but it's just making that task seem achievable for that child rather than overwhelming them. Similarly, task checklists can really help with that understanding of what a child is expected to do. You can present that in a visual form and the child can tick it off, or for some children, they don't need the visual, they're quite able to read the instructions of what it is they need to do. But again, they're clear, they understand what it is that's expected of them. They can go through and tick it off, and they're not feeling overwhelmed by what the task is. It's important here to touch on as well special interests in autism. So again, it's another kind of key characteristic and it fits in with that monotropism. Most autistic learners will have some specialist interests and things that they like to do. It can be really important to tap into these for some children who aren't able to translate those interests to other activities. I've just put up some examples there. I've had a child before who's really into cars and we literally taught all his maths through cars. We had many garages doing many different things. Similarly, children that are interested in animals, you might want to focus their writing around that, but it's ways to try and hook them in using that specialist interest. Sometimes you need to get a little bit creative with it, but there are normally ways you can use that specialist interest to hook them in. Okay, so then moving on to social interaction, which again, there's a huge variety in where children may be at with these skills, but it is one of the key areas where a person with autism may really struggle in school setting. Again, there's a huge spectrum with where children may be at, and I wanted to start and just touch on intensive interaction. So in more and more in mainstream settings, we are seeing children with a higher level of need, and many of these children just don't know or have any interest in any people around them. Intensive interaction is a way of really helping and engaging children to take an interest in other people. There's lots of really good videos, and the clip I've got there from intensiveinteractionco.uk is on YouTube that you can go and watch to see. With intensive interaction, it's about mimicking that child and playing with that child at their level. So if that child maybe makes a noise, you might mimic it back at them. If they're making a hand movement, you might do it back at them. And initially, they may not respond or do anything back at all. But over time, you will find that those engagements start to increase. The kind of next step is kind of scaffolding and building on children's play. Now, again, a lot of autistic learners want to be on their own. They are very engaged in what they're doing. They don't want people to interfere. So it's that being able to go and sit down alongside them And initially, if they don't want you to interfere, you may just take some of the similar things and play alongside them. So doing something that you might then be helping them to extend their play. And over time, you might then be able to start interfering a little bit with what they're doing and join in with some of what they're doing. But you also notice when you're playing alongside them, they may be observing what you're doing and starting to pick up on some of those skills. I've got a visual there for my turn, your turn. So that can also be a really good skill to help and teach our autistic learner with, and that having supported with a visual can really help a child to understand. So initially that may just be with you and the child because they can't cope with sharing more than that. But if they're really managing to share an object between you and them, then you might be able to introduce other children. Really great place to start with that is a ball because you can roll it back and forth. But another favourite I know with many of our children at school is sending marbles down a marble run. And you may start with multiple marbles and start to reduce the number down each time you do the activity. So eventually there is one marble and you're each having to take turns with sending it down. So some of our children may be at a stage where they are able to interact and show some interest in their peers, but they may be getting those skills a little bit wrong. And a really great way to be able to help and support them is through social stories. And now a social story is a way of kind of writing down what social expectations are at a certain time to help and support a child to understand. Now online there is hundreds of social stories that have already been written that are available for free. There are also services that you can go on and buy different social stories. We often find that our setting will take some of the free ones, but we often find we need to adapt them specifically for our learner. But it's a really good way for some of those children that are more able to really help them to understand some of those social rules and social expectations. Similar to social stories, comic book conversations can be used to help and reflect a child to reflect when an incident has gone wrong. So a comic book conversation session would happen by sitting down with a child, following something that's maybe not gone quite right, and you would sit and sketch out with that child in a kind of stickman comic book form the different things that have happened. And in the first one you'll see they've got speech bubbles and also thought bubbles, and that can be really helpful for our autistic people to think about what the other people are thinking. And they've also thought about what did happen, but then they've reflected what could happen next time, so what they could do next time. The one on the right hand side is they've written out what could a way to support a child, so as to how to give a compliment to someone else, and so that's given them a really structured way to help them to go and engage and interact. And like when I was saying with the whiteboard, comic book conversations aren't about making something that looks beautiful and great, it's just about structuring and helping that child in a visual way to help and support with their understanding. So now I'd like to think a little bit about behaviours that we might see and behaviours and how we tackle them in our autistic learners. I wanted to start with this iceberg picture to really think about behaviours we see well, in our autistic learners, but also in any children in school. I passionately believe behaviour is communication. If a child is displaying a negative behaviour in something that we don't want to see, there is a reason behind it. And it is our job as practitioners to reflect and think about what we can change and what we can do to support that child so that they don't keep displaying that behaviour. So the iceberg shows at the top is the bit we only see at the very, very top. Is that behaviour, and it's really important not to focus on that behaviour or get involved or feel cross about what you're seeing. We need to become detectives and dig deeper and think about what is underlying that behaviour. And it's only when we as adults change what we're doing that we are then going to see a change in those behaviours. So touching on that, I just wanted to introduce and talk a little bit here about sensory processing, because I believe it's often where a lot of behaviours can arise from. So sensory processing difficulties are really common in autistic learners. So it can be a really good place to start with unpicking if you're seeing behaviours that you don't want to see, but you can't really unpick where you think they're coming from. So sensory processing obviously covers all the kind of 5 areas with our hearing and our smell and our taste, but it's also important to think about perception, so thinking about that kind of space around the child and how thinking, but also interoception, so what's going on inside for that child as well. A lot of autistic people may feel feelings more intensely than the rest of us, or some may not have those feelings in the same way. So things like some children may feel constantly hungry, other children may not actually know that they're hungry at all, and that might be the difficulty. So it's your job as the adult to try and be a detective and try and unpick some of those different things. So if you're seeing lots of negative behaviours, or a child who doesn't want to enter a classroom or something, it's important to think and reflect about the environment and think about whether there's things in there that might need changing that might help to reduce some of those behaviours. When we're talking to our children about behaviours, we don't talk to them about good or bad behaviours. We talk to them about expected and unexpected behaviours, because some of the things they may be doing to them may feel right and may feel good, and there may be times that those behaviours are appropriate for them as well. It's just understanding that certain things they do would be unexpected in certain settings. Now, that may be disruptive behaviours, but it also may be things, well, I've got the example there of a child picking their nose, and people might go, whoa, if people do that. So it's helping them to understand that that's an unexpected thing to do, and so then we give them strategies and ways that they can manage those things. Now, the terminology of expected and unexpected behaviour comes from a book by Michelle Garcia Winner called You Are a Social Detective, and she has created lots of really helpful resources with helping and supporting autistic people with their social skills and understanding the world around them. So if you're interested in finding out more, I would really recommend going and touching in on some of those resources. With our autistic learners as well, a lot of the behaviours you may be seeing is because they don't really understand their emotions that are going on. So it's important to try and help and support them with that. Now, on this slide, I've put up something called the zones of regulation, and I know it's being used increasingly more in well, most settings that I have seen. They're using something like this, if not the same thing. And the idea behind the zones of regulation is that you may be in any zone at any time, and there is no right or wrong zone to be in, but it's understanding that when we're in school and we're trying to get on with our learning, that being in our green zone is going to be the best place to be. So we talk to the children about supporting them and helping them to identify those different zones, but then also talking to them about the strategies that they can use to help and support them to move back to their green zone. And I've put up the website for zones of regulation again, and they're linked with You Are a Social Detective, and they have a lot of free resources on the website that you can use if you're interested in finding out more about the zones of regulation. So with our children and their emotions, for many of our autistic learners, the school day can be overwhelming, and there may become times that they do dysregulate. So I just really wanted to touch on co-regulation and how we support our children with that. I think the most important thing, if we can see a child is dysregulating, is letting them know that you are there for them. It's not about them in that moment having to be somewhere or having to do something, or I need you to do this. It is just being there and being present for that individual. Now, it will depend on the individual what they find the most helpful. Some children will want you to be down and right next to them. Some children will want that physical contact. For some children, they may need space. And it's really important, if a child is expressing, whether that's verbally or through their actions and their body, that they need space, that we give them that opportunity for that space and take a step back. I think often as adults, we want to act and intervene, and it can be quite difficult to take that step back, but often that can be the best action for that child in that moment. So it's just being reflective when a child is dysregulating and thinking about what you can do to support them with that. The key part is you keeping calm and just letting that child know that you are there and present for them when they're ready to engage. And for some children, that may be a long period of time before they feel ready and able to do that. Okay, the last thing I wanted to touch on was stimming. Now, stimming is a behaviour that many autistic people will use to help them to regulate. And it may present in different ways. I mean, the most common way, and most people refer to stimming or think about stimming, is the kind of, you see the flapping of the hands that you'll see some individual doings, but there are different ways that children may stim. So they may verbally make noises or sounds. Some of them need to do different touching movements, acting movements. Some of them, it may be through smelling or tasting different smells. It is really important for our autistic individuals that we allow them those opportunities to stim and have that chance to regulate. For a long time, there was a lot about trying to suppress those stims, because I think often they maybe made people feel a little bit uncomfortable. But actually, if it's supporting a child to regulate, it is important that they're able to do that. Now, alongside that, though, I do need to add the caveat that obviously certain stims in certain settings are not going to work. So a child getting up and spinning in the middle of a classroom is going to be distracting for other children. So some of that is teaching our autistic learners effective ways to stim that will work for them in that setting, or if they really can't cope within that setting, that they have a way of being able to get out and stim in a way that is effective for them. But I think it is really important to recognise that stimming in itself is a behaviour that autistic learners may need to do, and it's really important not to view that as, I suppose, a naughty or a bad behaviour, but maybe help and support them if it's something that's going to be disruptive to the rest of the class, support them in ways to stim and release that energy in a different way that can be used in the classroom.